My name is Jacy Reese. I work for Animal Charity Evaluators. I do research in this field of effective animal advocacy. It's the intersection of two social movements. I suspect most of you are well familiar with animal rights. The other one is effective altruism, and I'll explain that in just a minute. I know that most of you know English to some extent, but if you have any clarifying questions, if I say words you don't know or if I talk too fast, please feel free to stop me. Just raise your hand or even just yell out during the presentation. So first, I want to just give a little bit of background so it makes sense to everyone. Talk about effective altruism, this other idea that intersects with animal rights. It's really just defined as doing the most good, and that can be broken down into two pieces. First one is known in philosophy as the point of view of the universe. This is saying that we're going to want to do good in the broadest sense possible. We're not going to want to do selfish good in the sense that we're just helping ourselves as effectively as possible, or even those nearby us, or those of just the same species, or even those who just live right now. We also want to consider future beings, both humans and non-human animals. We want to take this very broad perspective so that we can really have the most impact, because you never know, even if you're in a country where people need a lot of help, there might be another country where your dollar or your hour can go further. There might be another species who it can do more for, and so on. The second one is kind of, once we've established this broad framework of doing the most good, how do we make sure to follow through with that? And I think that's mostly through a willingness to change our mind. That means that if we're presented with new evidence, like let's say some new facts about, the fur industry. So I come from the US, where fur isn't as common, I think, or at least the industry isn't. And I think of farmed animals as being this huge population. But it turns out that when I want to help animals in certain parts of Europe, the number of minks actually is pretty competitive, or about the same size or even greater than some animals used for food. So that could be a really compelling area. And whenever I encounter new evidence like that, let's say I go to a new country in Asia somewhere where actually like animal experimentation involves a ton of animals, and that's really what I need to be working on, I want to be open to that and willing to change my mind. Effective altruism doesn't just involve helping animals, of course. It also involves helping the global poor, for example. It can also involve caring for future humans, so with environmentalism or similar topics. So we want to be flexible within those two. I originally got started with global poverty and wanting to help people in the low-income countries. I felt like they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to the financial resources that I have, so my dollar could do a lot of good. And I think if I were still helping the global poor today, I would be doing amazing things and would be having a huge impact, and it would be great. But because I remained flexible, I'm now working on helping animals with my time, and I think I'm able to do a lot more good this way. So I'd encourage all of you to be flexible. I don't think I'm going to say anything that's going to make you want to completely change your life path, but you never know, and I think we should be open to it. So at the intersection of those two fields, there's this organization, Animal Charity Evaluators. We started in maybe about 5 years ago as part of the Center for Effective Altruism in Oxford. And they saw a gap in the animal area for an organization that was really focused on effectiveness, focused on applying the principles of effective altruism, focused on, for example, bringing in financial support into the animal movement from people who might not otherwise have thought about helping animals, focused on bringing really impactful talent, so people from top universities with really valuable skill sets, and bringing that into the animal movement. So they formed a group called Effective Animal Activism, which was the term that preceded effective animal advocacy. And eventually that organization decided that there was a big gap in charity evaluation specifically. Lots of people wanted to donate in particular. They also wanted to volunteer and work professionally, and just had no idea where to go, no idea what organizations to work for. They wanted to have the most impact. So for about the past 3 years, we've been doing charity evaluations. They've been getting better every year. We've really come to a list of top charities that we think are very valuable in the field. And what I'm going to talk about today is kind of the research that led us to those conclusions, the research that led us to support the sort of interventions that we do, the sort of tactics we can use to help animals. And there are really 3 steps to getting to those conclusions. 3 levels of research. First is foundational research. This is asking questions like, what are the largest populations of animals? What are the populations of animals where we can have the most impact for each unit of effort? So maybe there are many more animals used in the food industry, but it's very hard to help them. Or there are many wild animals out there. You know, if we think of all the lizards, all the rodents, you know, even like rodents killed in plant farming, it might be really hard to help them. So we want to consider that aspect of causes too. And this is all like kind of foundational research that doesn't tell us exactly where to go. It doesn't tell us exactly how to help, exactly what charities to support, but it helps build the other two. The second is intervention research, which I'll touch on after the first one. This is looking at specifically those tactics, things like running online advertisements to get people to go vegetarian. And then finally, those two build into charity research, which I'm not really going to go into today because it's kind of, I mean, you can look at our website and it builds on the other two, so it's kind of a more advanced topic in some sense. But this is actually figuring out, okay, I want to go work as a software developer for an animal group. Which group do I work for? I want to donate. Which group do I donate to? So to cover the first one, foundational research, we call this cause prioritization, looking at these different populations of animals or populations of humans and figuring out which one, where we can do the most good. And there are kind of, there's one conclusion that I want to just touch on briefly. I think there's a really compelling case to help farmed animals, particularly those used for food, but also those farmed for their fur. And the summary of why I think that's the case is that it's a huge issue. You know, over 100 billion animals are raised and killed for food each year globally. And each of us can make a big difference, as we've seen with, for example, the cage-free corporate campaigns that have been just sweeping globally. Those have done a huge amount of good, and they've been relatively low effort. So it's been just a few people, honestly, campaigning with good funding behind them and good supportive organizations, releasing investigations and talking to companies, and really doing a whole lot of good for animals. The three factors that go into farmed animals being such an important cause area are first scale. Like I said, it's a very big area. I don't think I really need to go into depth because we're all familiar with this sort of thing. But also it's neglected. So relative to that size, relative to it being, you know, compared to cats and dogs in our homes, 99.8% of animals used by humans. These are US numbers, forgive me, it's very hard to get data for these sorts of things. We barely have it for the US, much less globally. And then the percent of donations allocated, there's this huge discrepancy. There's this huge kind of disproportionate allocation of resources. So 1% of donations go towards those 99.8%, and 99% of donations go towards the 0.2%. And what this signals to us is that if we add $1 or 1 hour to the left side, then we can really do a whole lot of good. We can lift a whole lot of weight on this seesaw. And that's really compelling, that neglectedness aspect. And then finally, tractability. So this is the rate of social change of various movements. Again, in the US, data is hard to find. Elsewhere and in the US. Like the prohibition movement against alcohol, like women's suffrage, like same-sex marriage. And what I want to show here is that these movements really were able to take off very quickly. Once they had dedicated activists and the right social kind of perfect storm of various factors able to really affect change. And it just went sweeping through the 50 states in the US, as you see in this graph. So this is each state adopting a new policy, and many of these follow very steep curves. And I think what this signals to us, along with other sources of evidence like social psychology research or marketing research, is that we can do a whole lot of good through very targeted, very effective activism. And in particular for farmed animals, I think we have good evidence from this. So for example, we have decent evidence that we can convince people to go vegan, eat plant-based diets, at least more plant-based diets, if not go entirely vegan. And that can do a lot of good. We can get corporations to make changes. We've seen that time and time again, especially in the past couple of years. And I think it's a really tractable area overall. So these three factors, scale, neglectedness, and tractability, I think indicate a really compelling case for farmed animals. Of course, farmed animals aren't the only area that's very high impact, and I'm going to touch on just two other ones. First is wild animals. We don't usually think about this because they're not being directly affected by humans. At least in most cases, there is pollution and other aspects. But really, there are so many wild animals in the world. We talk about how the number of farmed animals, 100 billion, very roughly, that doesn't really include all the fish, killed every year. But the number of vertebrates in the wild, so not including insects, but including rodents and similar creatures, gets up into the trillions very easily, at least like 10 trillion. And then if you include smaller creatures, which we can have that kind of philosophical debate, then it goes up even further. And these animals both have a lot of pleasure in their lives. They are able to be free and run around, but they also face significant suffering. Like I said, it could be human caused by pollution or by agriculture, so grains especially, and things that involve kind of going through fields with big combines and machinery can cause a lot of suffering to these animals. And then they can also suffer from natural causes, so illness, infectious diseases. They can have overpopulation, which can be caused by natural factors or by human factors that can lead to starvation and all sorts of other issues. I think this is a really compelling cause area. And that three-factor way of making these decisions that I discussed, I think the challenge for wild animals is tractability. Okay, like we know that we can get people to go vegan. We know that we can pass new policies for farmed animals. What can we do for these wild animals? It's a little harder. Like we can't get people to just eat salt or something that doesn't involve the insects and rodents killed in grain agriculture and these things. But it's a promising area to do research on right now, to take the initial steps, to build the animal rights movement such that 100, 1,000 years from now, we can really tackle this issue. Next, I want to discuss legal personhood. Has anyone heard of the Non-Human Rights Project in the US? So the Non-Human Rights Project is trying to work for legal personhood, the idea that at least certain animals, if not all of them, have fundamental legal rights, including the ability to file suit in court. So the ability to be a victim in our legal system in the US or elsewhere. And this is really a groundbreaking approach, even though it only directly affects a very small number of animals. If the Non-Human Rights Project gets legal personhood for a chimpanzee, that's going to affect a single animal. And when we talk about going vegan and just the number of animals you help per year is already far beyond that. However, this breaks through kind of a legal wall, as people in the field will say, where you have persons on one side, like humans, and not all humans were always on that side, and things on the other. And it takes animals, brings them from things into persons, and could allow us to pass, more sophisticated welfare reforms for farmed animals. It could allow us to abolish animal farming. It could allow us to do this whole host of things that could be really promising. Again, tractability seems to be the challenge here. How do you get legal personhood? How do you expand it to a wide enough variety of animals? But could be a very promising cause area. So that's all I'm going to say on that first avenue of research ACE has used, the foundational research, the cost prioritization. And now I'm going to talk about interventions. And this is kind of the most exciting part of the presentation, I think, just because of the numbers involved. But first, whenever we're thinking about interventions, we have to figure out how do we even decide which one to do? What sort of evidence do we have? What sort of tools do we have in our decision-making tool belt? And I argue we have four kinds, roughly. One, we can have direct observation, so we can see that we, for example, rescue an animal, and that animal lives a nice, happy life. This is compelling evidence. It's direct observation. It's clear. It's concrete. And we don't really have much doubt about the impact. We could also have this for policy change. We can see that a corporation made a policy change in response to a specific organization, and that other companies who weren't approached by organizations to pass a cage-free policy, pass a policy to have more plant-based options, didn't make changes. We can directly observe that. That's really good evidence that those interventions are working. We also have experimentation. We don't have a lot of that right now, but this is doing things like passing out leaflets to some people that talk about why you should go vegan, and then passing leaflets out to other people that talk about something entirely different, like global poverty or homelessness or something, and then trying to do a scientific experiment to see what the difference is in their dietary change. So we would look at the number of people, let's say 6 months from the intervention, and see how many of them reduced their consumption, how many went vegetarian and vegan, and compare that between those two groups. This is also really good evidence. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of it right now, but right now there's $1 million being distributed to researchers in the field of effective animal advocacy to do research in this area, which is super, super exciting. So we should have more of that evidence within the next couple of years. Third, we have history and case studies. So lots of people have thought about how animal rights compares to other movements and what we can learn from them. For example, we've had an intern at Animal Charity Evaluators recently looking into environmentalism, and there was a book in the US that was very influential in all of kind of Western civilization called Silent Spring, and this has kind of spurred the environmental movement onward, and we can look at what was the impact of that book. Could a book in the animal rights movement have a similar impact? What sort of timing does it need? And these sorts of things. We can use this kind of case study in history. We can use case studies more modern, like for the movement against animal experimentation or what have you, and learn from those specific examples. This is a little challenging to use because we don't have the sample size, if people have thought about that in science. We don't have the kind of broad, many pieces of evidence that we can aggregate together. Usually we're just working with a handful of examples, but they have advantages, like they can really account for the long-term effects of things. Whereas an experiment that looks at people 6 months down the road won't tell you whether that person became an activist 3 years after the intervention, which is a really important effect to consider. And then fourth, we have general psychology and sociology. These are findings from outside of animal advocacy that we can then apply to helping animals. I'm going to explain that with a quick example. So this is a pretty famous psychology experiment. It involved getting people to reuse their towels in hotel rooms. People were shown two messages. One was advocating just the direct environmental benefits of reusing your towels. It said it saves a large amount of energy, it saves money, it's really great for the planet, you should do it. The other one briefly touched on that, but mostly focused on just telling you lots of other people are doing this. It's the cool thing to do. Lots of other people in the hotel are doing it, so you should do it as well. You should reuse your towels. And we all like to think humans are very rational creatures, at least I'm rational, you think you're rational, so we should go with just the direct evidence, the thing that's actually telling us about what we care about, which is the environmental benefit. If you're familiar with psychology or have thought a lot about these things, you can probably guess this one was much more impactful. We're very social creatures. You had 35% participation, roughly, in the environmental group, and then 44% in the social group. They went further with this experiment, and they said not just other people in the hotel are reusing their towels, but other people who have stayed in your exact room are reusing their towels. And this shouldn't be more useful evidence. We don't expect people in our hotel room to be more similar to us or more of an expert on the subject than people in the hotel generally. However, then it bumped up even further to 50% participation, just that arbitrary distinction between people in the hotel versus people who stayed in your exact hotel room. So this is a general finding of psychology. This isn't the context of helping animals, at least not directly, but it can be applied to how we help animals. So for example, that brings me to my first intervention, which is online ads. These are used to get people to go vegetarian and vegan, and often they utilize that social messaging. So this one talks about a famous singer, Ariana Grande, shows her being shocked, presumably at some video that you're about to see, and gets people to click on it. Just says, have you seen this video? Talks a little bit about meat, but isn't confronting people with the animal stuff too quickly. Just getting people to have that sort of social pressure, say this is a celebrity that you admire and want to follow what she's doing, and you should follow suit and watch this ad. So we've done a whole lot of analysis on this to try and figure out what the impact is, and this is the really exciting figure. So this is 1 to 13 years of factory farm suffering spared per euro. Sorry I didn't do the conversion before this presentation, but that's a lot. That is years of some of the worst abuse you can imagine. I know most of you are familiar with how animals are treated these days. Per a single euro, this is the sort of change you can make by funding online ads to get people to go vegetarian or vegan. This is absolutely huge. There's high uncertainty here. We have to make a lot of kind of assumptions, and it's challenging, but we need to take the best stab we can at figuring out these results in order to know how to most effectively help animals. So this is less than the cost of a drink downstairs, a really big deal, and we can do a whole lot of good by donating. You can translate this to activism, although I don't know the exact figures, and if you let's say contact a few of your friends online and get them to watch the video, you can probably expect similar effects. Really impactful, and just shows us how we can potentially multiply the impact of our own dietary change, our own veganism, by getting other people to follow suit. Next, I want to discuss welfare improvements, which I've alluded to a few times. These are things like cage-free reforms that have recently been, changing around the globe, and they kind of started in the U.S., and then battery cage reforms started in Europe a decade or two ago. And these can be really impactful for a whole lot of animals. They don't reduce all of their suffering. They don't ensure all of their basic rights are met. They're not living on a sanctuary. They're still killed. But needless to say, it is a large improvement. There's some competing evidence that people might have heard of. There's some downsides to cage-free environments. But overall, most people think that that one in particular, but also other ones, represent a huge improvement in the welfare of these animals. We've done the analysis on this, and other groups have as well, and figures range from 13 to 28 years of factory farm suffering spared per euro. This is even larger. This is huge. This is a crazy impact that we each can have with our activism, whether it's our activism with financial resources, if that's what we've been fortunate enough to be gifted with, or whether it's our activism with our own hours and volunteer work or professional work, if that's what suits you. And this is just huge. It can do a whole lot of good, and that's what I really want to drive home with this presentation, is how much you can do by being an activist, by making these sorts of changes. A couple ones that are much harder to quantify, so I'm not going to actually give estimates for them. First one is undercover investigations, which, as many of you know from Poland or from other countries, really have the ability to spur a whole movement forward, to create a movement in a country. So right now, people are working on getting investigations released in India and in China, and these places where people might not even be aware of farmed animal abuse. At least they aren't thinking about it as much. This could get a lot of media attention and create new organizations, create new activists, create media attention, and all these sorts of things that really get the ball rolling for animals. These have, if I had to identify one biggest driving force for animals in the past 2 decades, investigations would almost certainly be it. It's been really huge, and these are very, very exciting, especially in those new countries. Another one that is, of course, a very interesting topic that people have been thinking about a lot lately is animal-free foods. This is a meatball, but it's the world's first cultured meatball. Have people heard about this? Okay, cool. So this was made in California by a group called Memphis Meats. It was made by taking animal cells themselves, just the individual cells, which can be taken painlessly from a live animal, and then proliferate, what's another word I can use for this, kind of grown and multiplied indefinitely, such that you don't have to continuously slaughter animals or anything like that, to create new animal flesh. It's real animal flesh. It has the fat, it has the protein, it has everything that meat eaters really crave. However, it doesn't involve animal suffering. It just involves one biopsy taken from a live animal at the beginning of production that can last for hundreds of years. This is a really promising area. Of course, the technology is very new. It might not come into play for a few decades. I don't think we should count on it. We should still be doing lots of activism. But needless to say, it's very exciting. There are also plant-based alternatives that many of you are familiar with. They're very great right now, and they're improving all the time. So there's the Impossible Burger that came out recently also in the US. This is something that as a longtime vegan and vegetarian, I had forgotten the taste of. When I ate one of those for the first time, it was just like a new thing that I felt like I had never experienced before, even though I knew I had when I was much younger. It had like the saturated fat, it had the iron, the metallic taste, the things that meat eaters really crave. And these can be game changing. So they've already have been. I talked to people who have been vegan much longer than I have, and they talk about living on making their own soy milk and just grains and just fruits and vegetables, which are great, but can be a challenge for a lot of people who are used to today's kind of different sorts of food. So it could be a really compelling area. It's a little more challenging for people to contribute directly to this technology if you don't have a ton of money that you can invest in companies or a really valuable skill set in science itself. But we can still contribute by featuring these products in our activism, by supporting groups that are advocating for policy change to enhance this industry. So there's like the Good Food Institute and New Harvest, other groups I can talk about more later. A really exciting area for animals. So finally, I'm not going to talk about charity evaluations tonight, although you have Open Cages here in Poland, which many of you are familiar with. Seems like a really exciting group. I don't know a whole lot about them. They seem great. They're also the Animal Charity Evaluators top charities that you can find on our website, and I'm happy to answer questions about later. But I want to talk about messaging tips. So this is in your day-to-day life, when you're talking about vegetarianism, veganism, or even another area like you want people to give to the homeless in your local city, or you want them to give to the global poor. How do you get them on board with the cause? And the first one, and probably the most important one I want to talk about, is an institutional versus an individual framing. So this means whenever we introduce an issue like farmed animal suffering or animal rights or global poverty, do we frame it as we need to end animal farming, so we as a society need to do so, or you need to go vegan, as in it's your responsibility, you're the guilty party, and you need to change yourself. I would argue for the former over the latter. There are many reasons for this that I have a whole blog post that I'm actually writing about right now, but to touch them briefly, it reduces a lot of defensiveness and guilt that you get whenever you tell someone that they're to blame for an issue. They immediately put walls up. They say like, oh, you're calling me a dirty carnist or what have you, and they just don't want to listen to you at all. Whereas if you tackle it as an external problem of like, hey, you and me, like we're good people, right? And there's this bad thing out here, this animal industry, and we need to collectively come together to oppose it in the way that people have opposed previous social movements. This is the framing they've used against human slavery or against damage to the environment. This can really get people on board. It also shows people a clear path to success that's bigger than just their own change. Lots of people get worried that their own veganism is just a drop in a bucket. They say, oh, I'm not even really saving animals, I'm just not harming them anymore. And that's kind of demotivating to me, even though it is a great thing. Second, I would say we should be kind and professional, but also bold. This is my way of negotiating the eternal conflict between confronting people, being aggressive, being strong, saying, veganism is a moral baseline, and then being, kind and professional, saying like, oh, well, I want to meet you where you are. You can reduce your consumption. I'm just like you. I was there once. I think there's a middle ground that's really compelling. So this is being kind. It means not being aggressive. This ties into the former one of not, putting the blame on the other person in the conversation. Be professional. Try and make yourself seem like someone who's similar to them. If you're talking to somebody who's a grocery store worker, say that, and you are a grocery store worker, highlight that similarity. Say that you're professional. You're not some crazy activist who they wouldn't want to listen to. But we should also be bold. So from that kind of aggressive standpoint, what we should take from it is the strong message. We need to end animal farming. We need to end animal exploitation. These animals have rights. I don't think we should compromise there. The area where we should, and I would hate to even call it a compromise, but do that is in our presentation, in our kindness, in our way of interacting with people. But our message should still be there. We should still be bold. I think this has similar pros and cons to the one before. So the main benefits are, it shows people that there's a big issue that they need to act about and they can act about. They can oppose the animal industry. They can become activists, which is really, really valuable. I would take one activist over, 100 just casual, vegetarians, for example. If that activist is going to, go out and probably in their lifetime create many hundreds of vegetarians. So this is another important tip. Third, we need to show not just why people should make changes, why people should take action, but how they should. So this ties into animal-free foods, for example. We should highlight these really compelling, really exciting, really tasty products that are out there. In many countries, especially in the US right now, everyone's on board with vegetarianism and veganism. Everyone sees it as like a cool thing to do. Okay, not entirely. I'm from rural Texas where there are cowboys and people might not agree with that, but lots of people are very on board with it. What they're lacking is the understanding that this is accessible to them, that this is something they can do, this is something that people in their peer groups are doing, this is something that doesn't mean they have to give up protein. It doesn't mean they have to give up rich fatty food if they're into that, which we can discuss the health thing another time. They're really lacking the how. An example of this is with online ads. As I discussed earlier, there have been two big approaches to those. First, people were doing what I showed earlier, getting people to watch an undercover investigation, usually not even telling them exactly what's going to be in it before, like not saying it's an investigation, but just getting people to kind of see the really compelling reasons why they should go vegan or reduce their consumption. The other approach has been a how-to approach. It doesn't even say, find out the bad things of the meat industry. It just says, hey, do you want to go vegetarian? If so, let me tell you how. And then it gives them a vegetarian starter guide, talks about how celebrities and other people are doing it. It doesn't show them graphic footage. It shows them nice, tasty food. And this has been shown to really increase the number of vegetarian pledges you get, the number of people who sign up with their email address and say, I pledge to go vegetarian based on this advertisement, per dollar. So it seems to be much more effective. And one of the hypotheses for why that's the case is that people in the US and in Latin America, where most of those ads are run, really know the why, and they're just lacking the how. The next one is individuals first and statistics second. Many of you have probably heard of this before, but this is the idea that if we give people just statistics, what's the quote? A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, or something similar. It's been attributed to all sorts of people in all sorts of different ways, but it's really this idea that people just get overwhelmed by numbers. They don't, individualize them. I would say humanize, but of course, individuals, not just humans. They just put up a wall of empathy. This has been termed in psychology research as the collapse of compassion. It seems to be a real issue for activism. So if we start out by talking about individuals. So people might have seen the chicken at the beginning of my presentation. I didn't talk about her because this is more of an animal rights crowd, but if I'm talking to effective altruists, I'll introduce the presentation by discussing her story. That's a chicken that lives with me that my partner and I rescued a couple years ago, and she's living a very wonderful life. You could see that she was debeaked, but she's overcome that. She's not bothered by it too much as far as we can tell. She's even on birth control implants to keep her from laying eggs and having to endure that misery. She's doing very well, and she's a sign of hope for people to latch onto. People can immediately feel empathy for her before I start throwing all of the scale of animal farming stuff at them that could really overwhelm them and keep them from having that empathy. And I would suggest that you do the same when you're talking about this sort of thing to people. So talk about a rescued animal if you know one. Even just talk about your dog and cat. And if you have neither of those, a companion animal, a non-human animal to talk about, just talk about yourself. Talk about how you've cared so much, how this has been really important to you, and that can still evoke a sort of empathy before you start talking about the facts and figures of oh, here's what they do to these animals, here's how many of these animals there are. For the final bit of the presentation, I want to talk about how you can actually help. Facebook, it's a mixed bag of tricks for activists. It's easy to get absorbed in discussions, unproductive discussions for days on there. But there's a group called Effective Animal Activism Discussion. I suggest you join it. You can even join it. Oh, the slides changed. You can even join it right now. I won't get mad if you get on your phone during the presentation, and you can do it at home as well. It's a place to engage with these sorts of critical ideas about how to help animals effectively. As I mentioned earlier, you can definitely donate. This is a huge way to do good. It's often underestimated. So lots of people think, oh, I want to help others. I want to do good in the world. I should go work for a nonprofit. I should just volunteer all my time. I shouldn't even work professionally. But that's not the right fit for a lot of people. Lots of people have a career that they love. They want to go into a career. They want to have lots of money. They want to live a very comfortable life financially. And for those people, something like earning to give, taking that high earning career in order to donate to highly effective charities might be the most impactful thing to do. You can start with ACE-top charities. You could also support Open Cages or a similar group if you're in a different country. Depends on all sorts of tax deductibility things that we can talk about. Next, if you do want to work directly, I would encourage you to look for talent gaps. So these are areas in which nonprofits or other groups are really struggling to get people, to get the right people. A classic example of this is Undercover investigators. It's very hard work to go into farms, to film the horror that happens, and often do your job in order to stay there and be able to get that footage. But if you're well suited for that, if you're an emotionally and physically strong person, that can be a huge way to do good, because it's so challenging for them to get capable people to do those jobs. And often the reason that groups don't put out more investigations is because of a lack of those capable investigators. So this is a talent gap. It's an area where they really need additional people, additional talented people. Another area that's coming up more now because of a large increase in funding is corporate outreach, working with companies to get them to adopt more plant-based options or higher welfare policies. And it's oftentimes hard to get people who are on board with the animal rights message and everything, but are willing to talk to company executives who usually live a very different life and have different values than their own. And finally, I would encourage anyone interested to join me in research. You don't have to do this professionally. You can do this on your own as even a blog post or something like that. You can look on Wikipedia. You can study the tactics of a particular social movement and write about it. This would be something that would be really interesting to me. It would also give you an understanding into the sort of research that went into this presentation, allow you to better understand these figures. If you're really interested in doing the most good, you can also look into our website at Animal Charity Evaluators, find some of our research, see if you can build on that, see if you can just maybe summarize it and share it with your friends. And really engaging with this research, I think, is a good step after you join the Facebook groups to get more involved in effective animal advocacy. So thank you. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to Open Cages for hosting me, and I hope everyone had a good time.